How are you all doing today? Good? Thumbs up for everyone? Excellent. Right on. It's so good to see you again. So to our audience members, welcome. And thank you for joining this conversation about IRT's production of T.J. Young's play number 6. My name is Detra Mills. My pronouns are she and her. And I serve on the board of directors of the Indiana Repertory Theater. This is my second year chairing the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. I'm very humbled by the opportunity to participate in such a meaningful way. And I am grateful to have the opportunity to spend time with some of my friends and colleagues in this conversation this evening. So we hope that you enjoy. We will be monitoring questions in chat, and we will also plan to have an opportunity to take some Q&A through Zoom and through our Facebook Live audience closer to the end of our time together. While we're gathering virtually today, acknowledgement of the land that we live and work on is critical to growing our mutual respect and our connection across all barriers of heritage. And so this evening, as always, we want to acknowledge that where we now call Indiana is the ancestral land of many indigenous people, including the Miami, the Piankashaw, the Wea, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Delaware, and Shawnee. And we pay respects to their elders, past and present. The Indiana Repertory Theater, where IRT now produces plays, was originally built as a segregated movie house in the 1920s. While many of us do not recall this time, this history must be acknowledged, and that is critically important as we work to create a more diverse, inclusive, and welcoming theater for all of us. Now I'll move into the introductions of our panelists. Again, so good to see all of you tonight. I would ask you to just maybe offer your affiliation, your pronouns if it is meaningful to you, and anything that you'd like to say as we kick off our discussion tonight. Dawn, you are at the top of my screen, and so I would welcome you, and you take it away.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to a really robust conversation and an important conversation with some amazing people, and I think I'll just pass it on, but I appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully some of my experience and things that have occurred to me in my life and my career will be applicable and can shed some light on some things here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. So for our audience, Dawn is a retired IMPD officer and has a lot of experience and insight that she has lived through in her career, and we look forward to hearing that from you, Dawn. Thank you. Sibeko Jywanza, good evening.
Good evening. My name is Sibeko Jywanza, Director of Food Justice for Flanner House. Also part of the exchange at the Indianapolis Urban League. I serve as the Vice President and Coordinator for the Indianapolis Kwanzaa Committee here in Indianapolis. Pronouns are he, him. I'm very happy to engage in this conversation about this play.
It's so good to have you. Thank you so much, Sibeko. Mr. Sklar.
Good evening, everybody. My name is David Sklar. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the Assistant Director and Director of Government Affairs at the Indianapolis Jewish Community Relations Council, and just really honored to be here to be a part of this discussion with the IRT and after this really powerful play, and just really pleased to be here with this esteemed panel tonight. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, David. Welcome. And last but not least, Dr. Lasana Kazimbe.
Oh, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. I am an assistant professor in the School of Education at IUPUI and in the Africana Studies program. and I'm also an artist, poet, and a spoken word artist and a teaching artist. So been in Indianapolis now, just under this fall, it'll be 4 years. I'm from Chicago originally. It's great to be here and sharing space with you in dialogue around this art. So looking forward to the evening.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll just jump right in. It's always important in art, particularly, to ground ourselves in place and in time and community, right? Here we are in Indianapolis. The play number 6 was based in Cincinnati, but the content of the play is expansive, unfortunately, across the United States. I'm curious to know if you, each of you would like to share a moment that may have resonated with you in the play, either based on location here in Indy or another location or community. To be fair, I will lead with my personal connection. There were many. I speak always with the voice of a Black Jewish woman, the mother of Black sons. And one of the things that was really compelling to me as I first read the script and then watched the play was just a real strong realization that you can't out hustle racism, right? You can't outrun it where you live, which is what I think Ella thought she was getting away from when she moved. You can't out educate it. You can't out earn it. You can't out hustle bigotry and racism. To me, that was a theme that recurred through the play. And I think that there were some ways that helped me compartmentalize that as I watched the play. But I'm curious to know what's your take? What's your take, Dr. Kazembe?
Well, I share with you that point. That's a very valid point. And I think resonating for me is I do work in the School of Education, working with pre-service teachers, and in my work as an artist, I've been studying, writing, researching, thinking, and talking about white supremacy, racism for close to 30 years. And what I've observed in that time is that, it's one of the most talked about, but the least understood things. And it's such a visceral thing to see it, as we used to say on the block, funky fresh in the flesh. To actually see it up close and personal is something that a lot of people struggle with. And so what happens, I think, often with a lot of folks is racism's number one goal is distraction. That's its number one goal, is distraction. Because while you're thinking about that, you're also not thinking about something else. And it serves that purpose. And it also, I think, when people experience it, it tends to inculcate certain feelings in certain people. And one of the things that it does is it infantilizes people in terms of their thinking. All of us can remember a time when you played peekaboo with a baby. And when you duck down behind that couch, you're playing that the baby, with its young developmental, still developing, it actually believes that you're gone. So that when you come back, that's why the baby is so shocked and surprised. And so sometimes there's an African proverb that says, simply because you cover your eyes doesn't mean you put out the sun. So there's this tendency that if I can just tell myself that I'm not seeing, or if I can tell myself that what I'm seeing is something different than what I'm seeing. So there's a great deal of deflection that goes on, and then it translates into a lot of self-deception. Confucius, the great Chinese Buddhist philosopher, said that the beginning of wisdom is calling things by their proper name. And so I think one of the obligations that we have as thinking, cognitive, featherless, upright, two-legged, linguistically conscious people, one of the obligations that we have to our own intelligence is to call things by the name that they actually are. And that is to engage in reality, and not to be an optimist, not to be a pessimist, but to be a realist. And so the great challenge there is that we struggle against with something like racism, white supremacy. You have to balance that against the mode that a lot of people are in, that they would rather believe than think. And that becomes a great challenge, particularly to people who are in education. So, but again, I think the answer, or not an answer, but closer approximations to truth lie in our ability to really wrestle with these reflective problematics, to be honest with ourselves, and to, above all, invoke and inhabit the virtue of courage. Because people, you know, the Christians and a lot of people in secular and religions talk about faith and hope and love. It takes courage to have faith, takes courage to hope, takes courage to love. But that's why courage is the enabling virtue. So I think if we begin to pivot more toward that and move away from the fear and the ignorance, I think we'll be in a better position as a species.
Thank you. People would rather believe than think. That's frightening. But sadly, I have to agree. David, how did you come to place yourself in time or community with number 6?
So one thing that really presented itself to me when I watched the play that I didn't necessarily pick up on as much when I read the play was this idea of helplessness and sort of watching all of the characters react in some way to feeling helpless with their particular situations. And, you know, as somebody who wants to always believe that there's something else that can be done to fix a situation, whether it's personal, whether it's professional, whether, you know, whatever that type of situation is, I act. That's just how I deal personally with sort of a sense of helplessness. And it may not be the correct answer. It might not be the right way to go about something, but I'm always going to want to feel like I'm doing something to try to change that situation. And I really picked up on that with each one of the characters, and how they sort of dealt with the helplessness that they were feeling within the situation, the entire situation of the play, but also individually, you know, from how the mom tries to protect her kids. You know, Felix is always trying to sort of do right by everybody. The daughter, how she sort of shuts down and reacts to situations that she's not able to handle within her abilities on the spectrum. Even the rioters themselves, who are sort of an unseen character in the play, and how they're reacting to what's happened in their community. So that's something that I really sort of took away and kind of was surprised to identify with so much as I watched the play.
So it can't be right or wrong. That action is your response, right? It just is for you.
Yeah, it is. If you ask my wife, you know, much to her chagrin, sometimes she'll tell me there's nothing you can do to solve this, you know, whatever the situation is. And I say, you know, for me, that's not good enough. That I feel like there's always something else that can be done. And so I feel like I really watched that arc with the characters. And, you know, I think ultimately it kind of got to a point where, you know, they sort of got to a happy medium. You know, at the end of the day, we do, I think, kind of realize that, you know, the status quo might maintain, or what we're able to do is limited, but we can still push for change. I mean, obviously they talked about this in the evolution of the academic theory that, you know, was present throughout the play. And ultimately she found that missing piece, and it was that, you know, we can change at the end of time. But I thought there was sort of an arc of kind of feeling helpless throughout the play.
Right on. Thank you. Mr. Jywanza.
So there's a lot of things that resonated with me as I read and watched the play. One of the things that comes to mind are the conversations that I had with my parents growing up about interactions outside of the household, and how these things have to be carefully kind of thought about as I move around, particularly the older that I got. And that I believe that kind of resonated with me throughout the entirety of the play, where there were other things that kind of hit a spot in my life. But the conversations that I was able to have really helped me to navigate some of the waters when I went outside of the home. There's a lot of young people who are not able to have these types of conversations, or have the type of parents that I have that are able to really sit down and explain. I still had to learn the lessons of what the outside world was all about. But in particular, like, I could see watching the play how there's no way once my family found out that that was a police officer, that person would have stayed in the house any second longer, right? And it would have been like, okay, it's time for him to go, no matter what. But also the fact of bringing somebody into the home, and how sacred the home is, and not having that space invaded, no matter what. Some of the things that I was looking at in terms of that wouldn't have happened had I had been in that shoe, or things like that, or my mother would have reacted in a different way. But those conversations are necessary for us to have, and there's not a lot of people who have the ability to have those types of conversations with their family, or have the family to have those types of conversations. And we get a lot of things happening outside of the household that just, without that type of support is hard to avoid, right? So that's the one thing that really resonated with me, was being appreciative of the fact that I had that background, and understanding there's not a lot of people who actually have that communication with their family to be able to navigate some of those things.
Yeah, right on. One of the lines in the play that resonated with me greatly early in one of the earlier scenes was when Felix said something like, never in the history of ever has a Black man punched a police officer and got away with it, right? And I mean, we can talk about what the media portrays, good, bad, or indifferent, related to situations like that. But that resonated very strongly with me, because I had those same conversations with my sons. So I see you and your family there. Dawn, where did you land? I wonder if this was a difficult play to sort of get your head around.
In some ways, yes, but we had another conversation with 3 or 4 of us, and Dr. Kazembe actually pointed something out to me that I, at the beginning, was a little somewhat miffed about, and then the more I thought about it, the more I thought how accurate it was, and I saw it demonstrated on the screen. I had previously just read it, and so in the play, we see the officer Kelly turn the tables. And Dr. Kazembe talked about that previously, about how there's such many times a brief period of time where the person who's been shot and killed by the officer is the forefront of the conversation. And then at some point it pivots, and it pivoted in the play. What about me? What about what I felt? What about what I did? Is what the officer's saying. And I just thought that was really powerful, the being pointed out to me and having to think through that. And we had a little more of a discussion about it in the previous opportunity to speak. But I think that was really eye-opening and powerful to me. I think there's obviously 2 sides to that when it comes at the end of the day, but I cannot tell you how much I appreciated that perspective, and having to sit with that and having to think through really how powerful of a statement that was and how accurate it was, because we're as we said in Indianapolis, clearly things happen. And I think someone pointed out in the last time we spoke about some of the Twitter accounts that are very pro-police, that start throwing information about. And So it's kind of an awkward position for me, to be perfectly honest, but at the same time, the whole idea, I think, whether I'm a rookie or at this point, almost a 40-year veteran of policing, that I start to continue, well, I continue to learn, I continue to be open to the conversations and to be maybe an ambassador, if you will. So I just really appreciated that. I thought it became very powerful when I actually saw it as the play itself unfolded.
Thanks, Dawn. One of the things that, because I've known you for a long time, that I've always appreciated and respected was your willingness to continue to learn. And I find that to be such a critical pathway, right, to eradicating so much drama, right? Once people make themselves, their minds and their hearts open, things change, or there's the opportunity for change, right? So there's a point in the play, and you alluded to it, Dawn, where we see police officer Kelly, this white cop, seeming to struggle with himself, right? And out loud discuss, what his perspective of his role in this violence against the Black community was. So what he says in the play was, well, what would you have me do? I felt all kinds of ways about that. And I have some ideas, right, about what I would have had him do. But I'm curious from each of you, if you were in that place, how might you respond? What would you have that officer do post facto?
So I love what the mother said, but it's a beginning, right? So I believe the mother said that, you said that you rode in the ambulance with the young man. Why don't you tell that story? And that opens up a whole nother can of humanizing the police officer in terms of how they felt and what they were going through during a tense situation where a Black male was shot. And we don't get that perspective at all, right? But I think there's a reason why, right? There's also a reason why, because society has police officers in a particular role, and it is a protected aspect, particularly when you're on the job. And the media and the stories that come out and the PR that come out are for a particular thing, and you rarely have an actual officer come off script and talk about their personal experience with that. I mean, you might get an interview 5 years, 10 years down the line, or something like that, but you don't really get an actual accurate account of how that officer was going through in that time frame. And so this play in total really tried to tell his particular side of the story, whether or not he felt bad about it, or his drinking had a result to that, or he was trying to do something good. But we in the community, we don't see that at all. What we see is business as usual. This happened, and usually the narrative is turned around to where, particularly with the Black male being shot, that it was his fault in some kind of way automatically. So we get that narrative pushed out there, it's public, and we don't get to have that humanized side of the police officer or the particular person who was shot as well. And I think that advice that the mother gave was a starting point in terms of saying, like, you have a responsibility to talk about your perspective of that and give that part of the story so people can have that total aspect of it. If it's just one narrative or one description that's put out there for the media on the officers we have, then we're going to get that and that's it. Usually we don't get the people, the family members and those who are shot unless they go off script and get their own interview, right? But that one particular officer or those three officers who felt a certain type of way that's not a part of that script, we don't get that, right? So do they have the courage enough to sit up there if they have a different story to tell and to tell that story that could actually help to make sure we see the full, complete picture of what happened? Because we can't see that picture of the person who was shot because they're dead. So that picture is not there. So it's up to the people who are there to actually give that perspective. And it might be skewed because it's not the perspective of everybody. But if it's different, you have the courage to actually do that.
So what I'm so tracking with you there, what I think about is, medical doctors having made an error in surgery, for example, and, being told by everybody that is there to protect the medical profession, you shut your face, right? You don't get the opportunity to speak. But their role, their oath is to first do no harm, right? And so how do you square that? I don't know. Anyone else?
Well, that's, yeah, I think I appreciated something that Ella, the mother, that's my daughter's name, by the way, Ella, so I was really resonating. One thing she said in the final act, there was a really powerful line she invoked where she said, what's disappearing is doing what's right. And I tell my students that we talk all the time about professionalism and integrity and how, for example, teaching, cosmetology, being a barber, being a police officer, being a lawyer, these are licensed professions for a reason, because there's supposed to be a set of conduct, a code of conduct, a set of standards that sort of sets this apart from people making widgets. There's supposed to be, even there's a set of conduct and rules. So I think one of the things that happens, however, when racism comes into the fold, into the mix, a lot of white people become mystified over what is the right thing. So I put this in an educational context where the teacher, for example, 2 plus, I hope you follow me with this, 2 plus 2 is 4 if you're in Fishers and Carmel. But if you're on the Far East side, you don't know that 2 plus 2 is 4. You're mystified somehow. So you're mystified over how to locate and find the human value in human beings who do not look like you. Like you find it on Sunday when you're in church, but something happens when you leave church and now you encounter someone that looks different from you. All of a sudden, a different sort of framing comes in that mystifies you. And I think oftentimes with a lot of white people, what it sets up is it sets them up to have a less than genuine relationship with truth. And so with Kelly, I was wondering about this character as I was watching him. I was wondering, did he connect this sort of a spiritual identity crisis in himself? Did he connect that with his self-destruction, with his drinking? Because he is a man who went and got bombed and he's carrying around a firearm and he let himself be, what I mean? So I was wondering if he made those connections. And so to pivot it back to racism for a minute, and what would you say to the person question, there are, from my perspective, there are 2 pillars that are upholding white supremacy racism. One of them is white intent. And to push against the script that white people are given, like they're given this script from day one. It's an invisible script. And this is a script that tries to conscript them into becoming carrying the water for racism. That is to say, engaging, participating, condoning in the practice of white supremacy and carrying it forward. And I think one of the things that I was saying, I like the brother Jywanza's point about the humanizing, locating the humanizing practice that he engaged in terms of riding in the ambulance. And I think if he were to, or what I say to people is just that oftentimes the solution that you're looking for or a good practice that you're looking for, people are looking outside of themselves, but the real test is to really look within. And I think that's, that to me is one of the beautiful aspects of this play. And it really harkens back to what the playwright Samuel Beckett wrote about this thing that he called the mess. Right, and he called it the mess, and he said that our goal as artists is to find a form that accommodates the mess. The mess is going to be there because we're all cracked vessels, but we have to try again. We'll fail again and fail better. So each time out, you want to become a little bit better. You want to try to uncover a bit more truth, but again, that takes courage. And then white people have to see some sort of interest in it, and that comes around to this is the last point about this notion of propriety, doing the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do, right? And that is a real. For a lot of people, that's a wide gulf between that, because we're often, as human beings, so used to wanting a reward or wanting recognition and stuff. But in this regard, this is the reward is your own humanity. You can win that back. So that's it.
Yeah, right on. Thank you.
I honestly can't add that much to those excellent comments. I think I completely agree with both Sibeko and Dr. Kazembe. I think one thing that was hard for me to, Detra, to your question, like what would we expect? I think there's a difference between what we'd hope and what we'd hope to see and what we expect to see in the real world that we live in, not in the play. And I think Sibeko's absolutely right that it's hard for us to digest that there might be introspection or there might be remorse, or because we don't get to see that, and so it's hard for us to watch events like this happen in the community because we don't get to see that side. We don't understand the decision-making process, and it may be years before we understand the circumstances, and so to a certain extent, it feels like the play sort of wraps everything up in a little bit of a nice, neat little bow that we don't necessarily get to experience as a community. And Dr. Kazembe is absolutely right that when it comes to this profession, it's almost a little bit hard to have sympathy because they're expected to get it right every single time, and and when they don't, there's a tragedy. So that's. I'll just sort of stop there and say that it's a little hard to digest. But one line in particular that jumped out to me, and I jotted down for myself when I was watching the play. Again, sort of speaking to Dr. Kazembe's point about recognizing those things when they happen, is when Officer Kelly says, "What about my pain?" and Ella says, "Well, I'm not saying that you're not hurting, but I'm saying you came to the party late. You've arrived at the party late." And that line really kind of stuck out to me. To just I think this overall theme that we'll probably end up at by the end of this conversation, just better understanding, better communication, better empathy, more empathy. That yes, you're hurting, but you're also arriving late to the game.
Yeah, one thing to tack on to what Mrs. Sklar said, that's a wonderful point, because often too with racism, white supremacy, what a lot of people do is they collapse it down to the individual. My individual feelings, my individual subjectivity, and when you do that, what you do is you miss the institutional and the structural. And that is the real webbing that has the most impact. Not the individual racist that you run into on the street that calls you out of your name, but the wider structural injustices, the institutional injustices that are embedded in the carpet fibers of America, of the United States. They're embedded in the very wallpaper and foundation of it. And when you collapse it down to the personal and only deal with the primacy of people's feelings, you miss the entire forest because you're obsessing over this one little old sequoia. You miss the whole forest when you do that. And so that's why I think it pays to have a systems analysis about this. And the other thing relative to I think we need to also, in the history and how we describe these events that go on, we have to make a serious distinction between a riot and an uprising. Intelligent people don't riot, when they're confronted with injustice. There's a thinking that goes on. When you think about a riot, you're thinking about just mindless sort of mania, right? But this is an organized, structural, human, normal response to the institutional and generational injustices that go on. And so again, if you are only dealing with white supremacy, racism on an individual sort of emotional knee-jerk level, you can be affected by and witness and observe visceral and the things that are the most obvious about it. But what you miss is the invisible violence, the invisible psychic violence and the invisible structural violence that's going to be there long after the looting stops and after the bricks stop being thrown and the sirens cease. That invisible structural violence in terms of food injustice, in terms of the lack of access to fresh water, fresh fruits and vegetables, brown fields, lack of infrastructure, the entire panoply of issues that are affecting communities like on the Far East side of Indianapolis. Those are the sorts of invisible structural violence that the people who live in those zip codes have to deal with every single day, while people who live in the Golden Ghetto and other more affluent areas of this, they don't even have to see this stuff. And so now for you to come face to face with it now, and instead of dealing squarely with it, but you want to claim whiteness and you want to be, feeling in your feelings about it. Well, that's not fair. You can't do that, because you're going to miss so much when you collapse it down to the personal.
Well,
So
that's what Ella told Kelly, right? Now you're on blast and you don't get to hide, right? And as a Black individual, we never get to hide, right? We're always out front. And so welcome, right? Because there's a lot going on here. To tie what you just said back to the play from an individual and a systematic perspective, one of the most powerful scenes for me that really set me off was at the end, when the officer is talking to his son. Hey, buddy, I just wanted to hear your voice. How are you doing? Isn't that what every parent just wants, right? You just want to make sure that you're talking to your kid at the end of the day. So yay for him as an individual being able to do that. But what about all of the Black and brown folks that don't get to talk to their kids at the end of the day and don't have their stories told, right? So we only have a couple of minutes left before I want to open the opportunity to do a little Q&A, but I mentioned the media earlier, and I think it's important because the media tells our stories, right? I think Sibeko said earlier, if you're not taking the opportunity to put your story out there, to put the truth of your involvement, existence out there, in that vacuum, someone else is going to tell your story, right? And I think that I have noticed a change in the media over time where, we used to see, the Black kid that was shot was always this crazy criminal, and here's his mugshots, and here's just all of these bad things, where then there would be these really lovely pictures of police officers and their family, and like it was a total setup of good versus bad, right? And it was garbage. And I think that I've seen a bit of a turn, not far enough to center, but some progress. But we still don't get the fulsome view through the media, or through dialogue like this of what happened, and therefore the beauty of art, right? I wonder if any of you feel like there's hope that you see or feel through stories that are told in the media, the way that things are represented, the organizations that you belong to, your involvement, the action that you're taking. Where's the hope in number 6 for today?
It's funny, real quickly. I just sort of had a parallel conversation today with someone about domestic violence, for example. how many cases, if you want to call them, where individuals are caught in these horrific situations, and how many times that they stay, and how overwhelmingly sad and depressing that can be. And then one time they get out and they make the change and they turn it around. And so to me, that's what I fight for. You know, I want more than one time for sure, but I definitely know that there's one out there that will stay with the process, to stay with getting to emergency housing, stay with getting to transitional housing, and allowing things to change in their lives. And so I guess it's not exactly the same thing that you're asking, but the bottom line is I think there's hope there. And so I think there's hope everywhere. I think a lot of times people want to get mired in what's negative instead of seeing that within all of this is there's some brightness. There really is. And, you know, even just having this conversation to me is hopeful. I've met people on these two conversations that I would never have met before. And I have been enlightened, and I have had, I've had my bell rung, so to speak, in a way, in terms of opening and thinking about things differently. So, you know, I'll never forget that I'll never ever forget that I went into a really very poverty-stricken area years ago, and it was a dank, lower level basement apartment, and it was, and when I say dank, I mean dank, dirty, wet, damp, and I walked by. And I'm talking 35 years ago, I walked by and this woman had this really I don't remember what the Bible saying was, but it was an uplifting Bible saying on there. And I thought, man, if I lived here, I don't know if I could look at things like that. But I've always remembered that. So there's hope in darkness. There's a light. So maybe it sounds a little bit too trite, but the fact of the matter is, I'm like, if this gal can think things are okay and good and there's hope, then I know I can. So.
Right on. Thanks, Dawn.
Well, I think for me, the hope is in our greatest resource, which is our children. I'm a father, and I believe, I love all children. And I believe that children are extremely resilient. I believe that they are extremely intelligent. They come here intelligent. And I believe that most people, when confronted, will do the right thing. And by the right thing, I mean that doing what's right. Right is that which protects, promotes, and upholds human life and human life and goodness. And so I believe that children are not, they don't come here hating. They don't come here being racist or sexist or bigoted in any way. But again, they encounter damaged adults. Some adults, like Nas used to say, who are in that second childhood. Some adults who never really quite transcended. And that's the unfortunate thing. Parenting doesn't come with instruction books. You have to so I believe that the children that especially the young children, and that's why I think art is so important, to introduce art into people's lives at a very, very early age, to have these kinds of conversations around contentious issues, around issues that are just foreign to you and different and stuff. And I believe art has that capacity to create and induce that sort of humanizing ethos with other human beings. So that's where the hope lies for me, is that dealing with young people, having serious conversations with them, teaching and speaking the truth, but also confronting falsehood. We don't want to live in Candyland, but we need to be able to tell the truth about things and to name things, but also to have a conversation that helps us transcend tomorrow and transcend ourselves.
Teach them well and let them lead the way, right?
The concept of hope, they mention no hope because there hasn't been change in the play, right? Like it was kind of like that concept is no hope. And I understand now, because we have to change in order for that to be there. And I think individually we're having an awakening on being able to name systematically how things are within our society, and where the community members or the police officers play their role in really breaking that down. And we're doing a great job of doing that, but what we're not doing is changing how the system is set up. And that's, that's something that might have to take a dismantling. It might not be able to be patched together because of the fabric of this system and the way that it was built for, in particular, the police force and police officers to protect wealth. And we're looking at the attacks on people who are not wealthy or not considered to be wealthy within the society. And so when that concept and when that mentality changes, then you can probably see more of a systematic change. But the things that happened last summer here in Indianapolis and that happened throughout the United States might have been a little more visual to people, but they were the same things that have been happening here in this country since the inception and then even before. It may take a different form and things like that, but there has not been much change when it comes to mentality of how America has treated its people. And in terms of the media thrives on the story and what that story is like. And I believe in the discussion group that we had before here, I was speaking about, I can see the young man if the tables were turned and that fight that endured when outside, if he didn't knock that officer out and the officer ended up shooting him, that story would be different. Even if the officer was drunk and things like that, it would have actually probably taken an immense of the officer to really be looked at in terms of a criminal charge. And if that officer ended up killing that young man, then a lot of the things, like you said in the media, on where that young man, while he was out during curfew, what was going on, that criminalization of that person would have been out there. And I've seen that, and I believe that would have happened. And that's how I think it would have happened if I was in that situation. But turn those tables, if that young man would have actually done something and killed that officer and in that scuffle and how all those things, would have reacted. And that's kind of what we're dealing with when it comes to the storytelling of the media as well. And I understand that particularly for police officers and police force, that is their job, right? And so we're looking at them doing their job, and they're very critical about how they do their job, and they have the policies and procedures, and these are community members that, this is not their job. So police officers engaging with the community person, that's their job as a police officer to do that. And that's my only pushback when it comes to, particularly when he's like, what about my boy, whether or not I come back home and things like that. Like, that's a very valid concern for him, and it should be, that's his concern. But there are things that we choose to do in the fields that we choose to go into that have that danger, where if I'm worried about coming home because of something that I did not choose, because I was born into this system that automatically puts a target on my back, we have to really look at, okay, we're going to make things safer for these officers to do their job, fine. But what are we doing to make things safe for me to live in an establishment that I was born in my whole life?
I think that your comments and your insight and your lived experience, it for all of you, all of us, is valid and powerful. I want to close with one of the statements that was made by Felicia in an early conversation with Officer Kelly about dinosaurs, right? She told him, look, dead things tell stories too. Well, not really, but how they died tells us a lot, right? And like, I'm all verklempt. That is so moving and powerful for me, because how they died tells us a lot if the story is told. If we have the opportunity to engage in dialogue and broaden our understanding, if we want to move beyond privilege and bias and prejudice. If you want to see me as a human and not as a danger. Any closing comments that, and briefly, that anyone wants to make? There is one comment in the panel that I'm not going to address here, but we will get back with you. I think that we've touched everything else, and I do want to say, before I turn it over for you all to close, that I would like to acknowledge that playwright TJ Young is engaging with us virtually in this conversation, and we see you, we applaud you, we thank you for your work. Thank you for joining us as well. I'll turn it over for close. Dawn.
You know what? I literally right here on this notepad have the exact same quotes that you had just spoken of, Detra. I felt that was incredibly powerful too, and I would reiterate, it's but the way they died can tell us a lot. And I thought at the end of the day, that might, in a weird way, be the theme of the play to me. So I just, again, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I never want to stop learning. So keep sending questions, information my way, and I'll keep trying to absorb it. So thanks again to everybody here. Appreciate it.
David.
So I think my final comment, and again, that Detra, your final quote also spoke to me, and I don't want to leave us, I don't intend to leave us on a sort of a pessimistic side, but sometimes I wonder how much the white community would want to be involved in these types of conversations if we hadn't sort of been forced to watch the video of George Floyd a year ago and seen, a man's life taken away from him, over the course of almost 10 minutes with a knee to his neck. And, I think that really speaks to Sibeko's last point. And so I guess what I'll leave with is that I hope that we will push the conversation forward. These conversations about understanding, about listening, are great, but we've mentioned a couple of times here systems, and this is where I work primarily, in my professional capacity within systems, within government systems, within nonprofit systems, within structures, and everybody on this conversation is exactly right. That is where the ball needs to be pushed forward. That's where the conversation needs to be forward. And so, again, not to sort of sound crass or demanding, but I think we're getting to a point where these types of conversations, we've had a year now and longer for certainly communities of color have been having this conversation a lot longer than I think everybody. And so it's time that we all take a part in pushing that conversation forward. And how do we change those systems? How do we change the structures? How do we deal with the institutional bias that's really going to change this conversation?
Thanks, David. Sibeko.
I would say that we need to listen to the story of our society and understand what it's trying to tell us. There is a reason why people are protesting and have been protesting. Please listen to what's going on with these individuals. There is a reason why we see Black people being killed on a consistent basis. There's a reason why we see people of color being killed. There's a reason why we see poor people being killed on a consistent basis. What is it that our society is telling us? What type of society we live in? And let's not wait until our society actually dies for them to be able to tell our story and what it might say. We can dictate that narrative now. And it will take more than conversations. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people who are waking up to the fact that we need to start having conversations, but it won't be until we start taking action within our lives that we will actually see some true change.
Great tie-in. Thank you so much. Dr. Kazembe.
I appreciate all of that, what was said, and I appreciate just having this ability to gather and share space with everyone. So thanks to you, Deidre, and thanks to IRT for actually setting this table, which was really, really powerful. And of course, the artist, the playwright. So I think I would want for us to continue using our art to as a mirror, and to use our art and leverage our art for what it's for us, to have these difficult conversations and contentious conversations, and also to use our art in order to deal with the contradictions in society. That is one of the luxuries that we have as a species, that we have this ability, our brains have this teleological function. That is, we have the ability to think about the kind of future that we want to create and then create it. The reindeer can't do that, the grasshopper can't do that, but we can do that if we so choose. And I want to always just leave people with the importance, man, of just the arts and humanity, especially the arts and humanities to life, human life and development. When you teach, and that it should not be absent from any area of human endeavor. You cannot teach STEM. When you teach STEM, for example, without teaching the humanities, you create Spider-Man villains. And when you teach theater without teaching the humanities, you create Batman villains. So we need to understand this stake that we have. And the great poet, the late great poet Gwendolyn Brooks wrote in her wonderful poem, Paul Robeson, "We are each other's harvest." So that is the kind of collective humanity message that I'd like to sort of draw from this and share, invite everyone else to draw from.
Thank you for that. And thank you all again so much. This has been inspiring and uplifting for me. I will just close with Timothy Thomas, right? This play was a fictionalized story about a family that didn't exist, but that riot existed. The shooting of that 19-year-old Black man, unarmed, existed. And he had a name and he had family. His name was Timothy Thomas. We must always say their names. Thank you all. Appreciate you. Be well.